Let me start with a simple but uncomfortable truth. Canada cannot hedge against the United States. Not with China. Not with anyone. The idea sounds sophisticated, even clever. Diversify, balance, keep options open. But beneath the language of strategy lies something closer to fantasy. Because hedging only works when alternatives are real. And for Canada, they are not. I've read the argument that Ottawa can offset American pressure by leaning toward Beijing. On paper, it feels pragmatic. In reality, it misunderstands power, geography, and the structures that quietly govern our lives every day. Over decades, Canada and the United States have fused their economies, defenses, and institutions into something no single government can undo. Not even a disruptive president, not even a trade dispute. If you care about how Canada actually survives and thrives in a world of great power competition, stay with me. This conversation matters more than it appears. Because before we talk about China, we need to understand what Canada truly is and what it is not. To understand this debate, we have to be precise about what is actually being claimed. The argument is not that Canada should abandon the United States. It's subtler than that. The suggestion is that Canada can hedge, that by deepening engagement with China, Ottawa might gain leverage, flexibility, or insurance against political pressure from Washington. That framing sounds reasonable until you examine what hedging really means in geopolitics. Hedging is not diversification for its own sake. It is not symbolic outreach. It requires credible, scalable alternatives across the domains that matter most: security guarantees, intelligence cooperation, market access, and crisis response. Without those, hedging is just rhetoric. Canada can diversify trade at the margins. It already does. But the leap from diversification to strategic balance is where the logic breaks down. Because Canada's dependence on the United States is not a policy choice. It is a structural condition built through geography, history, and decades of integration that no short-term diplomatic adjustment can replicate. And once you see that structure clearly, the limits of the China option come sharply into focus. To see why those limits exist, we need to step back and look at how this structure was built. The Canada-US relationship didn't emerge from a single treaty or moment of political alignment. It evolved through repetition, through crisis, through necessity. Over time, economic integration became so deep that borders mattered less than efficiency. Supply chains optimized themselves across the continent. Defense planners fused threat perceptions. Intelligence systems learned to trust each other by default. This is how structures form, not through intention but through use. More than $900 billion in trade flows annually across the longest undefended border in the world. Aerospace, automotive, and energy sectors operate as continental systems, not national ones. Provincial and state governments coordinate daily on regulation, policing, and infrastructure, often independent of federal politics. Overlay this with decades of integrated defense through NORAD and intelligence cooperation that cannot be replicated quickly, if at all. This is why political turbulence, even dramatic turbulence, doesn't dissolve the relationship. Presidents change, governments clash, but structures endure. And this is the core misunderstanding behind the hedging argument. It assumes relationships are modular, that they can be swapped. They cannot. And that brings us to the first real stress test of the China alternative. That stress test arrived quietly, and then all at once. In 2018, two Canadians, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, were detained in China. Not after a trial, not with transparent charges. They were held for nearly 3 years in what was widely understood as retaliation for Canada's arrest of a Huawei executive at the request of the United States. This was not an abstract diplomatic dispute. It was coercion, personalized. At the same time, China restricted imports of Canadian canola, a move that cost Western Canadian farmers hundreds of millions of dollars. The message was unmistakable. Political disagreement would carry economic and human consequences. This wasn't unprecedented. Australia faced sweeping trade punishments after calling for a COVID-19 investigation. South Korea endured tourism boycotts after deploying missile defenses. Other countries experienced similar pressure when crossing Beijing's red lines. The pattern matters more than any single case. When China is challenged, it retaliates. Even when the cost is high, even when the relationship is large. If you're finding this unsettling, that's appropriate, because strategic partnerships are built on predictability, not leverage. And if this analysis resonates so far, take a moment to reflect or share it. These choices affect real people. Now we need to ask the harder question, what kind of partner does this make China really? When you strip away the language of opportunity and engagement, what remains is a simple calculation: risk. China is not an unreliable partner by accident. Its use of economic pressure is deliberate. It treats trade, tourism, and market access not as neutral exchanges, but as instruments of state power. For a country like Canada, that creates a structural vulnerability. Canada trades roughly $86 billion annually with China. With the United States, that number exceeds $760 billion. This asymmetry matters. It means China can impose significant pain on Canada while absorbing far less in return. And Beijing has shown it is willing to do exactly that to advance political objectives. Layer onto this the issue of foreign interference. Canadian intelligence has documented sustained efforts to influence democratic processes, intimidate critics, and target diaspora communities. These are not hypothetical risks, they are active challenges to sovereignty. Any serious strategic partnership must rest on trust and shared constraints. But a system that blends economic leverage with political coercion offers neither. This is where the hedging logic collapses. You cannot insure yourself against pressure by turning to an actor that applies pressure as a routine tool. And yet China is often presented as the alternative, because the conversation rarely asks a more uncomfortable question: if not China, then what? That question forces us to confront Canada's real limits. Those limits become clearest when multiple crises collide. Canada today faces a convergence of demands that exceed its available resources. Arctic sovereignty is no longer a distant concern. As climate change opens new shipping routes and access to resources, the region is becoming strategically exposed. Recent coordination between Russia and China in Arctic waters has underscored that this is no longer theoretical. Defending the Arctic requires surveillance systems, naval assets, infrastructure, and sustained presence. All of it is expensive, much of it has been deferred for years. At the same time, foreign interference demands attention. Intelligence services have warned not only about China, but about a wider ecosystem of influence operations involving multiple states. Addressing this means strengthening intelligence capacity, protecting vulnerable communities, and reinforcing democratic safeguards. None of this is cheap. None of it is optional. And then there is the Indo-Pacific. Canada has declared ambition in the region, but ambition without prioritization becomes dilution. Engagement everywhere risks effectiveness nowhere. This is the second crisis, not explosive but cumulative. A slow erosion of strategic focus. When resources are finite, every new commitment carries an opportunity cost. Betting on China as a hedge doesn't solve this problem. It compounds it. Which brings us to the most overlooked dimension of this debate: what all of this means for ordinary Canadians. If you're watching this from the outside, geopolitics can feel abstract, but for you it isn't. When trade is disrupted, it's not a spreadsheet that absorbs the shock. It's farmers watching prices collapse, workers facing layoffs as supply chains seize up, communities realizing that decisions made far away carry very real consequences at home. When foreign interference goes unchecked, it's not just an institutional failure. It's pressure placed on families in diaspora communities. It's intimidation that doesn't make headlines. It's a quiet erosion of trust between citizens and the systems meant to protect them. And when defense and sovereignty are underfunded, the costs don't appear immediately. They accumulate. You pay later through reduced security, diminished influence, and fewer choices. This is why strategy matters, not as theory, but as lived experience. You deserve a foreign policy grounded in realism, not aspiration, in trade-offs that are acknowledged, not hidden. And if this perspective resonates with you, if it helps clarify why these debates matter, share it. These conversations only shape policy when they escape expert circles. Because what happens next doesn't just affect Canada's standing abroad, it shapes the kind of country you live in. And that leads us outward to the global consequences of these choices. Zoom out, and Canada's choices don't exist in isolation. They ripple outward. In a world defined by great power competition, middle powers are judged less by what they say and more by where they anchor themselves. Allies watch for signals of reliability. Adversaries probe for ambiguity. Strategic clarity becomes a form of power. A Canada perceived as drifting, attempting to balance between Washington and Beijing, would not be seen as independent. It would be seen as uncertain, and uncertainty is destabilizing. In North America, coordination on security, supply chains, and crisis response depends on trust. In the Indo-Pacific, partners like Japan, South Korea, and ASEAN states are navigating their own complex relationships with China. What they value in Canada is not equivocation, but consistency. A partner that understands its role and plays it well. Globally, the lesson of recent years is stark. Interdependence without trust becomes vulnerability. When states weaponize trade, technology, and information, alignment matters more, not less. Canada's influence has always flowed from being a credible, dependable node in larger systems, not from standing between them. And once you accept that reality, the question shifts from who can Canada balance to something far more consequential. What future paths are actually open? If we're honest about constraints, three futures come into view. The first is the discipline path. Canada accepts that its power lies in depth, not breadth. It invests seriously in Arctic defense. It strengthens continental security. It focuses its diplomacy on regions where its interests and capabilities align. Engagement with China continues, but without illusions. Trade where possible, dialogue where useful, no pretense of partnership. In this future, Canada is respected because it is predictable and prepared. The second path is muddling through. Canada maintains ambitious rhetoric but spreads its resources thin. It gestures toward China, reassures Washington, and tries to be present everywhere without committing fully anywhere. Nothing collapses, but nothing strengthens either. Influence erodes slowly, choices narrow quietly. This is the most likely future if hard decisions are postponed. The third path is the most dangerous. Canada convinces itself that flexibility is strength. It leans further into strategic ambiguity, underinvests in defense, and treats great powers as interchangeable. When pressure comes, economic, political, or security-related, it finds that hedges fail precisely when they are needed most. History is unforgiving to middle powers that mistake optionality for leverage. The future isn't about choosing between optimism and pessimism. It's about choosing realism over comfort. And that brings us to the final question, what this all demands of policymakers and of you. So let's end where strategy always should, with clarity. Canada does not need a new patron. It needs a sharper understanding of itself. Geography, history, and power have already drawn the boundaries of what is possible. Ignoring them doesn't create freedom, it creates fragility. Managing the relationship with the United States is not a failure of imagination. It is the central task of Canadian statecraft, defending Arctic sovereignty, contributing meaningfully to continental defense, protecting democratic institutions, and removing self-inflicted economic barriers. This is where leverage is built. Quietly, patiently, credibly. Engaging China is not a mistake. Pretending it can substitute for Washington is the most dangerous illusion in geopolitics, is believing you can opt out of structure. You cannot. You can only decide whether to work within it intelligently or collide with it unprepared. If this analysis helped sharpen how you see Canada's choices, don't let it stop here. Share it. Continue the conversation. The next chapter is about what concrete realism actually looks like in policy, and why fewer choices made well often produce more power than endless options. Because the world doesn't reward wishful thinking. It rewards those who understand how it actually works.